concluding that I listened to the introductory observations with which the Honourable Finance Minister prefaced this year's budget presentation. Disappointment that his interpretation of last year's performance of the 10th Parliament was so one-sided that it evinced the very intransigence and want of flexibility in national interest that is sought to berate in office. Disappointment, too, that his understanding of what transpired over the early months in the life of the 10th Parliament has led to such a contraction in his vision of the transformative potential of United Action. I choose to believe, perhaps in an excess of generosity, that it has been his own disappointment in the dashing of his higher hopes that has led to the reduced expectations we find in this year's prefatory reflections. Let us remind ourselves of the larger, more hopeful expression of the idea of United Action in last year's budget speech. And I quote, "The political configuration that emerged from the 2011 elections, whereby the party in government does not hold a clear legislative majority, is a domestic novelty even in similar situations have been experienced by other democracies the world over. This arrangement beckons our country into a new political epoch and heralds an opportunity for the nurturing of a new political culture. The prevailing dispensation will test and hopefully prove our resolve as a people, and within this House, our respective will to serve as responsible representatives of a deserving people, to work together in service to the cause of national development." Not surprisingly, these words drew much comment in last year's debate from members on both sides of the House. To appreciate what I've called the Honourable Minister's contraction of vision, set these words alongside those that seek to speak to this idea in this year's presentation. The vituperative, tendentious paragraph condemning, quote, "the veritable plethora of examples of parliamentary action occasioned at the behest of the opposition's one-seat majority," unquote, has already drawn comment from my colleagues on this side. I say only, the Honourable Minister should not have expected so much so soon. In answer to the theme, "Overcoming Challenges Together, Accelerating Gains for Guyana," and listening to the unfolding debate, I'm strengthened in the belief that the most crucial challenge we face in this House and in the nation is a challenge to forge the togetherness required to confront the challenges of development. We will not overcome challenges together until we confront and overcome the challenge of togetherness itself. It is the prior challenge. Before I attempt to address some of the policy and operational issues surrounding the low-carbon development strategy, and then the mining and agricultural sectors, it would be useful to look briefly at the fundamental principles relating to land use policy and the management of natural resources. Budget 2013 gives primacy of place to the multidimensional low-carbon development strategy. In Section B, Paragraph 4.2, it's referred to as the paradigm overarching policy framework. Intended as it is to serve as that overarching policy framework, the strategy must be informed by and predicated on an integrated approach to land use management with the following objectives: to ensure avoided deforestation and degradation, to guarantee the provision of ecosystem services, to promote the responsible exploitation of natural resources, to invest in the creation and promotion of enterprises which have a low carbon footprint, to ensure the conservation of biodiversity, and to ensure inclusive and sustained development for the benefit of all citizens and future generations. For such an integrated approach to land use planning and effective implementation of the low carbon development strategy, an absolute prerequisite is transparent dialogue and ongoing discussions at all levels so that communities, regions, public and private sectors are informed and have their perspectives and expectations taken on board. The parliamentary opposition must be engaged in an ongoing way by the government in free and frank dialogue and discussions on the evolution and implementation of the strategy. This should be done through the sector committees of this National Assembly, and I would suggest, given the centrality of the strategy, a special select committee on the low carbon development strategy. The outcome of such dialogue and negotiation must reflect the nation's interests and the will of the people. After all, Mr. Speaker, land, including maritime assets and airspace, is the national patrimony, and use of these resources must of necessity generate confidence among citizens rather than promote fear, well-grounded or not, that Guyana is being taken over by foreigners or that corrupt and discriminatory practices dictate how land is allocated and resources managed. Before I leave the issue of land use, allow me to quote from the December 2012 summary of the report of the Development of Land Use Planning Project, entitled Guyana National Land Use Plan. On page 5 of the report, this is a document, a summary report of the Development of Land Use Planning Project, DLUPP. It's been circulated by the Lands and Surveys Commission. On page 5 of the report, under the head Legal and Institutional Issues, it says this: a legislative review of laws and regulations related to land use planning found that 1. Land use planning is the subject of obsolete legislation that neither reflects contemporary planning practice nor meets the needs of Guyana, and that Guyana is in dire need of comprehensive new land use planning legislation. The development of a national intersectoral land use planning system is an obligation under the MOU with the Government of Norway as part of the RED Plus process in pursuing the LCDS. An institutional review concluded that the institutional framework is dysfunctional, largely due to ad hoc sectoral legislation rather than legislation to policy. The regulatory and institutional framework is inadequate, with missing policies and coordination, as well as duplicated regulatory responsibilities. Control over land use is highly centralized and politicized. GLSC is empowered rather than required to do things. It is not guided by strategic level performance measures, has struggled to achieve financial sustainability, and has weak enforcement.
Good morning. Good morning. Happy Mashramani, Happy Republic Day to all of us. It's a day when we should be celebrating our Republican status. But today we also mourn the loss of one of the leading voices of our post-colonial experience, one of our leading voices of our independence and our Republican status, Dr. Rupert Roopnarine, who passed away early this morning, 2:15. He was 83 years old, and anyone who has followed public life in Guyana from the 1970s to the present would be familiar with his name and his presence. He was a leading member of the WPA from the time he returned to Guyana in 1977 up until the present. He was part of the Working People's Alliance as executive member, as co-leader, as member of Parliament. WPA joins with the rest of Guyana, the Caribbean, and the progressive world at large in mourning the passing of this towering figure of our independence. As many would know, Dr. Roopnarine has been ailing for the last few years, but he continued to keep on and to struggle. And finally, today, he took his flight. We remember Rupert Roopnarine, Rupert to us, as one of the unique figures of our politics and society in the last 5 decades. He was WPA, but he belonged to Guyana, and he took his Guyanese identity very seriously. Dr. Roopnarine was an educator, an artist, a political activist. His legacy is enormous, but I want to zero in today, this morning, in these early hours after his passing, on what I consider to be his monumental contributions. The first thing I want to say about Rupert was that if any public figure in Guyana transcended race and ethnicity, it was Rupert Roopnarine. Even for someone like myself who takes ethnicity and race very seriously, it was difficult for me to conceive of Rupert as an Indian, an East Indian. He was. He never ran away from his East Indian identity. Those many people may think that he did not take his East Indian identity seriously. He did. He was East Indian, we knew. But he had a way of transcending race and ethnicity. He was very comfortable among Black people. And that tremendous capacity, very comfortable. He was equally comfortable among East Indians and Amerindians and people of other races and ethnicity, but significantly, he was one of the few public figures that was comfortable among Black people. You knew that Rupert wasn't putting on when he was among African Guyanese. He was just comfortable. And I think that gave his politics a uniqueness that many others did not have, in that he could empathize with the sufferings of all of the peoples across race and ethnicity. I once, so many times I heard Rupert said, if there's one dogma in the WPA, it is that we will not move until all the races in Guyana move together. And he lived that out in his political life. He lived that out. He was a believer in the multi-ethnic solutions of Guyanese politics. And he didn't stay where he was and speak to other ethnicities. He was always there in the trenches. He would remind me so many times of the many godchildren he had in Buxton. One of my sons is his godchild. So I think that is the first legacy, his legacy of transcending race and ethnicity in a very racialized and ethnicized society. And I think it was a tremendous feat and something that will enrich our politics if we were to rise as a nation and live out that promise. The second thing about Rupert Roopnarine I would like to point out was his optimism about a multi-party solution. We talk about multi-ethnicity just now. It's believed that all the parties in Guyana, the PPP and the PNC and the WPA and others could work together. As early as 1990, when the life of the government of that time had come to an end and there were electoral reforms that could not be put in place in time for the election. And Rupert and the WPA proposed that instead of the government of the time continuing beyond its mandated tenure, that while we awaited the electoral reforms, that there should be a national government of the PPP, the PNC, the WPA and other forces. And when we took the proposal to the PPP, they said the PNC would never agree to it. Rupert was optimistic, and he led the WPA delegation that went to see Mr. Hoyt. And Mr. Hoyt agreed to that national government. He agreed to the WPA proposal. We proposed that we have an interim government of all parties, and that he, Hoyt, as the incumbent president, should remain president. Dr. Jagan maybe becoming the prime minister. And to the surprise of many, as I said, Mr. Hoyt agreed, and it was Rupert who was, the WPA agreed, but Rupert was our leading voice, and he led the delegation that met with Mr. Hoyt. Later on, when we were faced with a similar situation in 1997, after the 1997 election, and we had the court case that said the use of electronic ID cards was unconstitutional, and the PPP was forced through the Ord-Munson Accord to give up 2 years of its office. Rupert again suggested in the National Assembly that instead of going back to an election very quickly, or the PPP continuing on, that there should be a national government for the 2 years that was cut off from the PPP. The PPP, of course, blocked that. They said no way. And I gave those examples to show that Rupert Roopnarine was the consummate multi-party national government advocate. It is now more than a footnote in history. It is now a historical fact that the architects of what we now know as the APNU were Rupert Roopnarine, Clive Thomas, and Robert Corbin. They tried to work on what was called a third force. Before that, they didn't get very far with it. But when Robert Corbin approached the WPA, Corbin, Roopnarine, and Clive Thomas sat down and hammered out a partnership for national unity, which is now a household name in our politics. I think Rupert was the person who gave the coalition that name, a partnership for national unity. We remember him as the prime ministerial candidate for the APNU in 2011 with Brother David Granger as the presidential candidate. And we remember Rupert on that campaign trail, really carrying the torch for the APNU, galvanizing the crowds. We remember his refrain, "No place for Donald, no place for Donald," referring to Donald Ramotar, who was then the presidential candidate of the PPP. And the fact, Rupert pointing out the fact that in none of the PPP governments up to that time did they find a place for Donald Ramotar. And Rupert would regale the crowds. No room for Donald. He was, with all due respect to Brother David Granger, Rupert was the live wire in that campaign. And as we know, the results of the 2011 election brought the PPP into minority status because the AFC and the APNU got a majority in parliament. The APNU AFC would coalesce before the 2015 election and go on to win that election, a slight majority. Rupert became Minister of Education. He had begun to introduce some new reforms in the education system, but he took ill and had to be relieved of that position. He was named as the head of the public service, but by then his health had begun to deteriorate and he was not able to finish his term. So that's the second legacy of Rupert, the eternal optimist that a national solution in the form of a national government, and he spent a lot of his political energies working for that. Rupert Roopnarine was a great political communicator, one of the best. I would argue that alongside Forbes Burnham, Rupert is the next colorful orator. As you know, he studied the English language and he didn't make joke with that. He had a way with words and phrases, which made him a consummate communicator. When he started out, I remember in the 70s, it was a little bit, he had been out of Guyana for about 15 years and he had come back. And it took him a little while to get into his stride. But once he got into his stride, there was not a better political communicator than Rupert Roopnarine. Yeah, I remember going with him in the villages and hear him speak, and you would hear the men, and especially in the villages, in both Indian and African communities, why the man could talk, And political communication is an important aspect of political activism. It is the ability to get people to listen to you and to be able to explain complex things in the public sphere. He was a great political communicator. What is not known much, because this is internal, he was a great political organizer, organizing the party. There's a popular thing that the WPA died when Walter Rodney died. Well, when Walter Rodney died, the WPA was not even a political party. They had just called themselves a political party, became a political party in July of 1979, but there wasn't a party. There weren't party groups across the country at the time of Walter's murder. But after Walter died, the party broadened, expanded. We formed party groups up and down the country. The party became a party after Walter Rodney died. It's difficult because people repeat something, The WPA died when Walter Rodney died. The WPA. And Rupert was one of the leading organizers, going around the country, forming groups. And like I said, he was comfortable in all communities. He would go into Indian communities among sugar workers. And then he would go among bauxite workers in Linden, and he was equally comfortable. So he was one of our leading organizers, building the party, building party groups, building the party capacity. So that's the third legacy, the fourth legacy, I think, of Dr. Rupert Roopnarine, tremendous political organizer of his time. Rupert, of course, was your quintessential Caribbean radical of the 70s and the 80s and going forward, steeped in working class ideology loosely called Marxism, but he was equally steeped in a Caribbean philosophy, a pan-Caribbean outlook of the world, that you are from the Caribbean, these islands. And coming from these islands, these post-plantations, there's a particular view of the world, and Roopnarine had that view, a Caribbeanist view. So his Marxism was tempered by a Caribbean worldview. So to understand a Rupert Roopnarine, you have to understand the coalescing of Marxism and Caribbeanism and anti-imperialism, which made him and those of his generation unique, the Caribbean radical tradition. That's what Rupert Roopnarine came out of, the Caribbean radical tradition, and he carried that torch for the rest of his life. Rupert was not just a political activist. He was an academic par excellence, trained in languages, English and literature. He, in his time, was the expert on Martin Carter's poems. I, as a young man, learned a lot about Martin Carter poetry and poetry in general from Rupert Roopnarine. I had gotten some early training of it at school through some of my teachers. But when I met Rupert, who, you know, some of Martin Carter's poems were difficult to figure out, and Rupert was the expert on Martin Carter. In fact, his film, his documentary, The Terror and the Time, because apart from an educator, he made films. He was part of a group called the Victor Hara Collective, and they made the documentary The Terror and the Time. And they used Martin Carter's poems as the soundtrack, along with the Yoruba singers, for the documentary The Terror and the Time. Rupert was, you know, what you call a bright boy, the tremendous mind. You know, one of the things when Rupert got sick was, we all kept saying, you know, you don't see that mind that we saw, we grew up with. Tremendous intellect, the ability to analyze things, the ability to see the complexity and bring them together. Rupert Roopnarine was a giant. And he was a giant among giants because in the WPA alone, you had the likes of the Rodneys and Quianas and Clive Thomases, Maurice Odlo, Josh Ramsamy, Moses Bagwan Andaye, Bonita Harris. These were all great intellects. And Rupert was part of that pantheon. He taught at the University of Guyana. And what is not well known, he left the university, left his job to become a full-time activist. That is not well known. Sacrifice, personal sacrifice. Rupert was jailed many times, like many WPA people. He was locked up up and down Guyana. I think his favorite, well, not favorite, the place that he was locked up the most is Weldad police station. Because every time we would be going up to Berbice and so on, they would stop us at Weldad, detain you for 6 hours, so you wouldn't get in time for the meeting. And it was difficult to get around West Berbice, you know. But Rupert was locked up so many times. Of course, he was charged for arson in 1980, along with Walter Rodney and Dr. Omowale, and he was later freed of that charge. But as all revolutionaries, he had his time in jail. So he left his job at the University of Guyana to become a full-time political activist. But he continued to do academic work, going overseas and giving talks and lectures and so forth. And as I said, he was also an artist. He wrote poetry, he wrote prose, and he made films. I think Maha Shivratri is another of his films, an Indian film. And he had a couple of other documentaries that he made. So Rupert was a rounded individual. He was a Renaissance man. What is also not well known is that he was a formidable cricketer, played for Cambridge Blues. When he was a student there, played at the highest level. Many thought that he would have gone on to play for the West Indies had he chosen to play cricket. He would tell me that in the 1966 tour of the West Indies to England, and the West Indies played Cambridge, and he played for Cambridge, and that he bowled Gary Sobers, he bowled off breaks. So he was a Renaissance man. And the thing about people like that is that it was always a joy to be with Rupert. I had the privilege of campaigning with him. Some of my best time was when I would leave Buxton and go to Mahika where he lived, and we would go to West Berbice. This was around the 2011 election. And we would go into the West Berbice villages. There was a doctor there. He was a good friend of Rupert. He was an animal doctor. I think he's still alive, and he's still there in West Berbice. His name escapes me now. But he and others would take us around in the villages in West Berbice. And I've told the story many times where when we got into the villages and the people would tell us, you know, Doc, I'm glad you all joined and formed the APNU, because we now don't have to choose between Burnham people and Guyana people. Some would say Sydney King people. And I remember coming back from those meetings when Rupert would hear that testimony. And Rupert was not a very emotional person. One of the few times I would see him emotional, and he would say, you know, David, you know, we are engaged in struggle, and we are working for the betterment of our country, but we don't always know what's the effect of our activism. Here were people who were hamstrung by the fact that they had to make a choice sometimes between the WPA and the PNC, between, as they say, Burnham and Guyana, Burnham people and Guyana people. And I think that lesson, those lessons, instilled in Rupert that it was the correct thing to do to form the APNU. Searching for a national government was the correct thing to do. There was the lighter side of Rupert always. He was a good, you know, engage in small talk. So there's the human side of him, you know, hang out, and he wasn't a drinker. So There was no drinking, but he could have a good time and so on. So we mourn the loss of Rupert Roopnarine. And while he walked Guyana and walked the earth, he made a tremendous contribution to his country. I would argue that Guyana is better in many regards because of Rupert Roopnarine. Better because of Rupert Roopnarine. It's maybe difficult for a lot of people because Rupert is a contemporary of Walter Rodney and Clive Thomas and Dye and Maurice Odlund, Josh Ramsamy, Guyana, Bagwan, Bonita Bone, Jocelyn Dow, and others. And so therefore they're all stars. But Rupert was a star among stars. And he carved out his own niche in the annals of Guyanese politics. He was on the progressive side of our politics. Always looking to make life better for the poor and the powerless. Always searching for the route to freedom. I could call Rupert my mentor, I could call him my friend, my colleague. We knew this day was coming, but we hoped that it would not come so soon. He was just 83 years old. He has gone back to the ancestors. As I said, Guyana is better because of him. His death may simultaneously, perhaps paradoxically, make Guyana poorer. Guyana is poorer with his loss. Because although he has not been active in the last decade or so, just his very presence, his name, meant something in our politics. Unity, civility, intellectual curiosity, bravery. Brother Rupert has gone home. Martin Carter said, "Death will not find us thinking that we die. Too soon, the banner draped for you. I would prefer the banner in the wind, not bound so tightly in a starlit fold, not sudden with my people's tears, but flashing on the pole. We bear aloft, down and beyond this dark lane of rags. Dear brother, if it must be that you speak no more with us, nor smile no more with us, nor march no more with us, then let me take a patience and a calm, for even now the greener leaf explodes, sun brightens stone, and all the river borns. Now from the morning vanguard moving on, we salute you, and we say death will not find us thinking that we die. Farewell, my brother. Take your flight, and you're gone. We who are still left here will continue to do what we can do to make your dreams that were not realized during your sojourn realities.
or effective, and the existence of special interest agencies such as the MMA further complicates matters. All stakeholders seem dissatisfied with the current arrangements, but there is no existing model from elsewhere that fits Guyana's needs. Mr. Speaker, the Budget 2013 speech is replete with the arithmetical wizardry, not to say legerdemain, for which the gifted honorable finance ministers earned a well-deserved reputation. What is missing, Mr. Speaker, is a strategic exposition of the increasing problems in key areas, such as the chronically underperforming sugar and electricity sectors. Instead, there is the impression of trying to plug holes rather than developing and implementing rationalized route maps to provide long-term development. There is no overall sense of the Ministry of Finance developing and rationalizing options, selecting best options according to clearly articulated criteria, and then proposing priorities. If we were following an agreed strategic plan, and especially one that was reflective of an integrated approach to development, the minister should have been reporting on deliverables that ought to have been targets for 2012, the actual performance against these targets, explanations for surpluses or shortfalls, and the rationale for adjustments that would have to be made in 2013, thus providing justification for the 2013 estimates of expenditure. In the absence of such a systematic approach, Mr. Speaker, there is a danger of incoherence, in the sense that proposals in some sectors operate directly against other sectors or intentions. This is nowhere more evident than in the competing interest for land required by investors for mega agricultural projects in the intermediate savannas, the Kanji Basin, and the Rupert. The Ministry of Agriculture currently assesses the feasibility of a project, but land allocation is the preserve of the Ministry of Natural Resources, creating an impasse that is frustrating to local and overseas investors. The inherent conflict in the forestry and mining sectors is a legacy of not having a land use policy. It's now being tidied up, I understand, so that logging concessions were awarded without recognizing that the GGMC had already given out mining permits in the same concessions. In the absence of baseline data related to biodiversity, endemism, and ecosystem services, the impacts of logging and mining on the environment cannot be accurately determined, since there is little or no generic data against which to analyze data now being collected, albeit inadequately and irregularly, because of the limited number of field personnel deployed by the GGMC, GFC, and the EPA. The other complication is that there are a number of instances where mining concessions have been awarded prior to the issuance of title plans to Amerindian communities. This resulted from lack of sharing of information that would have excised such concessions from titled land, or alternatively, through free, prior, and informed consent, and transparently conducted negotiations, a way forward could have been found to allow mining with safeguards and penalties that are enforceable. While I have some ideological sympathy with the rhetorical insistence that the funds from Norway are payment for services and not development aid, it has to be said that in the absence of a commercial contract, the current arrangement is vulnerable to changing politics if possible, and the Honourable Minister of Finance should exercise caution in treating the Norwegian money as if its flow is under his control. Because payments are based on the extent to which Guyana has managed the avoidance of or reduction of deforestation and degradation, we need to examine the extent to which policies and practices have been implemented to reduce foreign-based carbon emissions. And here I wish to make the point that Feel free to stop the clock while I check my bill.